And while everyone's concerned about the environment, few people actually take the time to learn anything about it.
Welcome everyone to Unsafe Space. I'm your host, Carter Laren. I'm excited to be joined today by Steve Milloy. Steve is a recognized leader in the fight against junk science with more than 20 years of experience and is credited with popularizing the term junk science. He's the founder and publisher of junkscience.com and an environmental and public health consultant. Mr. Milloy is a biostatistician and securities lawyer who has also been a registered securities principal, investment fund manager, nonprofit executive, coal company executive, and print and web columnist on science and business issues. Mr. Milloy served on the EPA transition team for the Trump administration. He's the author of numerous books and articles about health and environmentalism, including his latest book, Scare Pollution: What and How to Fix the EPA. You can follow him on social media, on Twitter at junkscience, and you can go to junkscience.com. Steve, thank you so much for joining and welcome to Unsafe Space.
Thanks for having me.
I guess, as mentioned before the show, I've been wanting to talk to you about climate change and environmentalism generally, but this latest documentary from Michael Moore and Jeff Gibbs really provided an opportunity to get your thoughts because frankly, it wasn't. It's called Planet of the Humans, and it wasn't at all what I expected to hear from Michael Moore or Jeff Gibbs. And for those of you who don't know Jeff Gibbs, he's an environmentalist, and he was a producer with Michael Moore on, I think, Fahrenheit 9/11 and Bowling for Columbine. How did this documentary strike you, first of all?
Well, I agree with you. It's not what I was expecting at all. I thought Planet of the Humans is going to be another horror story about how humans are destroying the planet. And it was mostly the opposite. It was mostly about how I have this rule, it's called Milloy's Law, where green equals fraud. And it's mostly about green equals fraud. There's a lot of apocalyptic talk and people hating population growth kind of stuff in the movie. But the bulk of the movie is about how renewable energy isn't really renewable. Renewable energy depends on coal, natural gas. Has a particular focus on biomass and how biomass, we're chopping down all these trees and then releasing even more CO2 emissions into the atmosphere. And then, Michael Moore, Jeff Gibbs' film goes into the funding sources and how people like Bill McKibben of 350.org and Al Gore and his partner Dave Blood and Robert Kennedy are sort of profiteering off biomass. It was really quite amusing.
Yeah, I felt almost so. They tore down the heroes of the environmental movement, both personal heroes and technological heroes. They were largely presented as charlatans, but I did feel like they still bought into the humans are horrible premise.
Oh yeah, no, there's no question about that. I mean, the theme of the movie is the apocalypse is coming, but and our solution is these frauds. So
right.
Yeah, I mean, they clearly hate people. They think that fossil fuels are destroying the planet. Of course, they think that now that renewable energy is destroying the planet as well. So I'm not quite sure what their solution is. It seems to be easier to just accept the reality that there are more people living a higher standard of living than ever before, and that's great. And our environment is really cleaner than ever before. That's great too.
Yeah, I definitely got the sense that the only possible solution the only conclusion you could draw in terms of solution is, well, I guess we need to dismantle modern civilization. Like that's the kind of takeaway. But let's walk through some of these things because I think a lot of people, I think you and I are probably more in alignment on our view of a lot of the environmental issues than someone like a typical Sierra Club member would be. But even for people who really care about or buy into a lot of the environmental messaging, this should be eye-opening for them as well. And maybe one of the first things we should talk about is energy density, because I didn't hear that addressed specifically, But that, to me, from a scientific perspective, is kind of the underlying big idea that causes all of these problems.
Well, yeah. So energy density, people think that biofuels are great because, when you do all the calculations, they seem to emit fewer greenhouse gases, but that's really not true. I mean, you have to actually burn more to get the same amount of energy out of, say, a gallon of gasoline or a gallon of conventional diesel. So there's really no savings going on. It's just more expensive and less economical.
So let's in the movie biomass burning was one of the big devils, which rightly so, right? He covered. I think one of the people in the movie from the Energy Justice Network, which I'd never heard of, says that if we cut every tree in the United States, it would be able to power the country for a year. Then what happens? Can you talk about the sustainability of biomass burning generally? Because a lot of these plants are also burning natural gas.
Yeah, I don't know whether his calculation is true. It may very well be. But historically, one of the reasons that, say, Britain switched to coal was because they couldn't afford to cut down all the trees. I mean, they would have had to cut down all the trees to power Britain in the 18th and 19th century. So fortunately, they had a lot of coal. And there's nothing else to do with fossil fuels like oil and natural gas and coal. You might as well burn them for energy. And the good news out of that is the CO2 emissions. Well, they help plants grow. Over the last 40 years, NASA's been taking satellite photos of the planet, and this has shown that the Earth is actually greener than ever before because we've had a little bit of warming, and there's more CO2 in the atmosphere. It makes absolutely no sense to go and just level forests for energy. I mean, we have other sources of energy. There's nothing else to do with oil and gas and coal. You might as well burn them for energy and whatever other byproducts you can make from them.
Well, and this seems to be also one of the odd things is the standard. I think for a lot of lay people, the standard that really resonates with them is human flourishing. They're concerned about when people say, hey, there's going to be massive global warming. It's always presented as catastrophic, which is not clear that it would be catastrophic anyway, even if it was the numbers that they said it was. But it's never couched in terms of like, well, what's best for humans? It's always couched in terms of our standard is to take a snapshot of where the Earth is right now, and we have to preserve it, which seems like a fool's errand.
Well, it is a fool's errand. I mean, whether you like it or not, the Earth is changing, the population is growing. There's nothing to be done about that. These people who are concerned that too many people are destroying the planet, I don't know how they go about deciding who gets to live and who gets to die or not be born. And I'm not quite sure of the morality of all that anyway. The reality, there's this Malthusian mentality has been around for several hundred years, if not longer. And it's always been overcome by technology. And, if you just take today's technology and project forward to 2100, well, you wonder, like, well, how are we going to get there? Well, of course, we'll develop the technologies necessary. I mean, there's plenty of places to grow food. There's plenty of water. Water is the most abundant substance on the planet. There's plenty of everything. We have, fracking unleashed. We had peak oil before fracking. Now with fracking, we've got oil that's almost for free. Yep. So, the Malthusians, the doomsayers, they always ignore, technology, and that's why they're always wrong.
So it's interesting that you bring this up because in the movie they present two sides as irrational. One side is the environmentalist movement that is relying on solar and wind to, quote, save us from our own destruction. And they present that as a fantasy. It's not going to happen. But then they present the other side as people who say, well, we'll never run out of anything. We shouldn't worry at all. We'll never run out of anything. And when you put it that way, it sounds irrational. Like, obviously, we could run out of stuff. But I guess what strikes me is as a free market guy, I've said this to my daughter a few times. Like, if we let the free market operate, we will never sell the last barrel of oil because it will be too expensive. If you let things operate, we might run out of particular resources, but replacements will naturally come along as those resources, as the supply of resources goes down, the demand for whatever they were providing goes up, and suddenly the economics of alternates change. Like, all this stuff kind of happens. It's unclear to me why we have to run around like the sky is falling, like suddenly we're going to tomorrow mistakenly, pull the last barrel of oil from the ground and oops.
Well, no, that's right. And as a corollary, if we're going to limit our consumption of oil today so that people can use it in the future, well, I mean, in the future, then they're going to limit the use of oil so people in the future can use, where do you stop? Right. It just doesn't make any sense, right?
Right. It also strikes me as an interesting philosophical premise that people are bad. Like, I view more people as a great thing because people come with innovation. Someone's going to invent a way to make cold fusion not like actually economically viable someday. Someone somewhere is going to be born that's going to help us usher in new forms of energy. And if people are only viewed, which I think the environmentalists do, if they're only viewed as a burden on the planet, we'll never reach these technological breakthroughs that we need.
Yeah, well, number one, I don't know how they set themselves up as getting to decide who lives, dies, and is born. I just think that's morally wrong to start with. I mean, they're lucky enough to be born. How do they get to decide the fate of others? Number two, I have this theory, sort of the theory of great men and I guess great women. There's a handful of people throughout history who have brought us to where we are now. Most of us are just sort of workers, implementing their ideas. Like Einstein's one. People have had great ideas, and they're what has made us through. And if you're going to go through just culling people, not letting people be born, I mean, how do you know who you're culling? You might cull the very person you're just describing, who's going to come up with the next great solution. We just don't know. So it's just wrong on all counts.
Well, and it also, I mean, especially for this group of people, tends to view themselves as humanitarians. And when I look at it, I look at, most of these people are in comfy first world positions. They go to Starbucks or Pete's or whatever and make sure they buy fair trade, and they've got a pretty comfy life. But when they talk about limiting accessibility to cheap energy is what has built our society. I mean, it's one of the pillars of modern civilization. There's a lot of places in the world where they're still burning trees to heat their homes. They're breathing in horrible gases. They can't afford power that's not intermittent to keep hospitals and refrigeration running. It seems like those people are the people that you're punishing the most if you're going to start banning this stuff.
Well, wealth is the key to health and a clean environment. And unfortunately, radical environmentalists are all over the world trying to prevent people from developing and becoming wealthy and being able to afford cheap energy and the appliances in the homes and the transportation that the rest of us enjoy to have a very high standard of living. I'm not quite sure what the logic is. I think it's very cruel and inhumane, but that is what environmentalists spend their time doing in the third world.
Yeah. So maybe we should talk a little bit more. We talked about the biomass, which was one of the major targets in this movie, and they I think pretty effectively took it apart, and that was good. They also, though, went after wind and solar. Maybe we should just talk about wind for a moment. One of the things they did with both wind and solar was talk about the constituent components necessary to build the equipment. Do you want to talk about that for a moment? And
yeah. So look, the reality that environmentalists don't like to talk about is that every aspect of our lives depends on fossil fuels. You can't have wind energy and solar energy or hydropower or nuclear power or unicorn power without fossil fuels. Okay, and it's everything. So a lot of the components that go into these, from the rare earth minerals and metals that are mined in China and wherever, you need fossil fuels to do that. You can't do that on Black & Decker battery powered tools. It just doesn't happen. You can't even build those tools without fossil fuels. So there's nothing that happens in our world without fossil fuels, and this notion that solar energy and electric cars and windmills and whatever don't require fossil fuels is just false.
Well, and there also seems to be this idea that it's this permanent solution. Like, well, I have my solar panel and I have my windmill. I'm done. Yeah, there was a cost originally with building it, but now that it's done, it's perpetual energy forever.
Yeah, no. Solar panels last about 10 years. Windmills, they have a lifespan of about 20 years, and then you can either leave them up as eyesores or replace them, I guess. But you can never really use the land again, because if you've ever seen the footprint of a windmill, as they point out in the film, it's like 800 yards of concrete and 45 tons of rebar. It's just incredible per windmill. Right. And it's just incredible. There's nothing green about them. And then you throw in all the birds they kill. My God, what's going on?
Yeah. One of the things that I knew about, so one of the problems with these technologies, other than their impact, frankly, their impact to the environment in manufacturing these things, as you just mentioned, also their intermittent availability, which I knew. I mean, we know that they're intermittently available. But what I didn't realize is that it sounded like almost all of these green energy plants were supplemented by natural gas facilities, all of them.
Well, I think Robert F. Kennedy Jr. said that in the movie. They're all really just gas plants with, a facade of solar and wind. You can't have intermittent energy without backup, and that backup is going to be coal, natural gas, or nuclear. But a lot of these plants, they focus on the Ivanpah solar plant that Google owns in the middle of desert someplace, California, and it has a gas plant to get going in the morning. What's so green about that? I mean, if you think that gas is not green, what's so green about that plant?
Right. I think I looked this up on Wikipedia before the show. Just to turn on in the morning, they emit 46,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide, which is nearly twice the pollution threshold at which power plants and factories in California are required to participate in the state's cap and trade program. So they're not green in any way, even by their own standards. They're not green.
Right. And, last summer there was this study came out at the University of Chicago done by not by anyone like me, but by greenies. And, they concluded that all these states that have these renewable energy mandates, all they've done is increase the price of electricity. They really haven't reduced CO2 emissions at all.
The other thing that struck me was, and I don't know if this is an area that you know a lot about, but the number just struck me when they were in the movie. One of the things they did was they visited Cedar Street Solar Array in Lansing, Michigan, and they had a guy there talking about the solar panels, which I assume are typical for solar panels, and he said the efficiency of these panels is just under 8%. And I think about the lifespan of a solar panel and the efficiency of an 8%, I just don't see how. Is that normal? Are they normally that inefficient?
Well, yeah. I mean, it takes a lot of those panels, to power. Like I think they had. I can't remember the exact number of panels they had to power 10 houses, but it was a huge field. And the guy said that if you wanted to power the entire city of Lansing, basically the whole country would have to have solar panels. It reminds me about 10, 15 years ago when I was running my mutual fund, we were beating up on General Electric because General Electric was one of the first big companies to buy into global warming. And General Electric was out there with this fantasy that, well, if we put solar panels on like 10% of Arizona, we could run the entire country. And of course, I mean, that kind of, it's insane, right? It's just insane.
Right. Well, this is a good transition then to one of the other targets of, so this documentary, for those who haven't seen it, I mean, go see it. But I guess there was a couple points to this documentary. One was the very real scientific and economic analysis of the viability of these things and how that was a charade. But also this guy had a hit list for people in particular. And one of them you mentioned earlier, I think, was Bill McKibben. He was the founder of 350.org. He also led the Keystone Pipeline protests. he's really presented as a shill for malinvestments in the green energy.
Well, Bill McKibben runs 350.org, and 350.org, of course, is the carbon dioxide level his group wants to go down to. As far as I can tell, Bill McKibben is just, the leftist in charge of, the climate wing of the leftist movement. And, I view the climate movement as a political movement, and it's just one of the ways they're trying to socialize society. And, it's Bill McKibben's in charge of that. And he's got a lot of traction because, he's a prolific speaker and writer, and he's a professor at Middlebury College, Vermont. But he also, he's got all sorts of connections that, the movie tried to depict him as profiteering off biomass. Maybe that's true, maybe it's not true. I don't know. There's a funny scene in the movie. Bill McKibben is being interviewed, and Bill McKibben can't remember who funds him.
That was one of the most disturbing parts to me because as a founder, I've founded several companies. I could not imagine ever being on the phone with anyone and saying, the question was, are you funded by the Rockefeller organization? And he was literally like, I don't know. I don't recall.
Who are your funders?
Sure. To the degree that we have any money at all, it's come from a few foundations in Europe
which ones?
And the U.S. Let's see. I'm trying to think who the biggest funders are. There's a foundation based in Sweden called the Rasmussen Foundation, that I think has been the biggest funder.
So you don't get money from Pew or Rockefeller or any of those big?
No, we did. Rockefeller Brothers Fund gave us some money right when we were starting out. That's been useful too.
But they no longer fund you?
I don't know. I don't have a sort of
really
funder sitting in front of me.
That's usually something that people know.
That is the biggest sign of bullshit that I can. No one cannot recall who their freaking investors are.
Right. I run nonprofits and businesses, and people have asked me that question. If I don't want to tell you, I'm just going to say I'm not going to tell you. Sometimes there's a very good reason for that because on my side of the debate, our funders will get attacked by the other side. So they value their privacy, and so I do too. But to sit there and deny that, I don't know, to deny that there is funding, not only is there unicorn power, but unicorn money is crazy.
Yeah, it just struck me as so dishonest. And that scene, I don't know, maybe just as an entrepreneur, that scene really bothered me. It was just so dishonest that.
Just say, well, I'm not going to tell you because, either it's a proprietary secret or I want to protect my donors. I can understand that. Just say that. Okay, that's perfectly rational. But to pretend like you don't know who they are, like there are none, is
yeah. So Bill McKibben is explicitly anti-capitalist. He's against this phrase hyper-individualism, which I'm not exactly sure what that means. I guess that means too much self-ownership and too much enlightenment. But this is a political movement. But I guess just for the people who aren't on board with my political or your political take here, people who care about they avidly believe in climate change and all the scare stories about it. One of the funds this is just interesting information for people. One of the funds that this movie covered is the Green Century Fund. It was recommended by Bill McKibben's organization, 350.org, and the fund is 0.6% solar and wind, which I would imagine most people who contribute to this fund think that's mostly what they're getting by investing in this fund. And 99%, this is according to I'm going to just read a verbatim, 99% things like mining, oil and gas infrastructure, McDonald's, biofuel, Coca-Cola, logging and paper companies, banks, lots and lots of banks, including BlackRock, which I guess is BlackRock is a particular devil for the environmentalists.
Yeah, and that's not unusual. I started paying attention to this 15 years ago when I was running my I had an activist fund. We were beating up on companies and CEOs that were trying to kowtow to the Greens. But what you find out when you look into these funds is they're really just index funds. Some of them are tech funds. There's nothing really green about them. Al Gore's fund with David Blood, Generation Investment Management, it's just a tech fund at best. It's a collection of mostly non-fossil fuel stocks. Of course, then the irony is, since everything depends on fossil fuels, everything really is a fossil fuel portfolio.
Right. Al Gore also struck me as interesting because they talked about his fund with David Blood. And something I hadn't realized. This fund was founded in 2004, in July of 2004. Yep. And Inconvenient Truth came out in 2006. Now, as someone who has been in business, my immediate question is, who funded Inconvenient Truth? Because that seems like a convenient marketing expense.
Yeah, who knows? The notion that there's no profiteering going on in climate, this is also some humanitarian movement, is nuts. You've heard of big oil. Well, there's big green, big climate, whatever you want to call it. Al Gore has made hundreds of millions of dollars, if not $1 billion, off his climate hysteria. Everything is done for profit. Nothing this big operates without money. And so, of course, they're all for solar, all for wind. They're investing in the subsidies. They get all sorts of support from big businesses who are happy to pay them to stay off their case. Don't bother us. There's a lot of money in the climate movement. It's not it's a huge industry.
You have a nice oil company. It'd be a shame if we maligned you.
It's definitely a mob mentality and criminal mob mentality. All these things that have been happening to President Trump and say Fox News and other Republicans over the last few years, the left has been doing this to climate skeptics for the last 20 years. They have marginalized us. They call us names. They call us deniers. They try to liken us to Holocaust deniers. They hit us first with these Zelensky tactics before they hit everybody else. So I just kind of chuckle. I watch TV every night and I see various media hosts complaining about being attacked by the left, but we experienced it first. And, welcome to the club.
Why is environmentalism, why were you attacked first? Why is that such a sacred cow to them that it's more important that they attack climate deniers? Literally, if you question anything, if you just say, well, it seems like maybe there's some warming, but I'm not really sure the amount and what we should do about it. Suddenly you're like a backwards ape who can't think for themselves, and you're subject to all sorts of derision. Why is that?
Well, asking questions stops, their quote unquote progress, right? Progress to them means doing what they want. And if people start questioning that, well, then there's no more quote unquote progress. So, and they have to silence people who are raising the questions. I've been doing this for 30 years. I came into this, I wasn't politicized. It's not terribly political, didn't really know anything about the environment, but just was curious about things, started asking questions. And I thought this mostly nonsense. Started, raising the warning flag about that. And all this, then I get attacked. And not just attacked, but savaged. And, they've gone after people that fund me, support me. It's just, it's been very, very difficult, very challenging. And all I'm doing is asking questions. Yeah.
And it seems like they have almost complete control of most of the corporate media as well, because it's to the point now where the default assumed correct answer is that anthropogenic climate change is real and catastrophic. That's like you can't really question that even in mainstream media. It's not just like the leftists are attacking.
Yeah, there's not much media that hasn't totally bought into climate hysteria. There's even at Fox News, there's a lot of climate hysteria going on there, and it's once you get past the evening hosts, oh my God, you're on your own, or Fox and Friends in the morning. But the bulk of the media is definitely hardcore climate act. I mean, they're the mouthpiece really for the climate movement, just like they have been, with Trump. I mean, it lines up almost exactly like that.
If I just take a survey of all of the leftist outrage, it all seems to be it's self-contradictory often, but one through line is just the destruction of Western civilization and capitalism in particular. And the Green movement has always, to me, really seemed like just Marxists with better costumes, I guess.
Yeah, no, that is the theme. What they're after is the destruction of society so they can rebuild it the way they want it, just like the Bolsheviks did in 1917. And Mao did when he came to power in 1949. And it's the same thing today. And what's really ironic, you can see this in real time because they are looking as coronavirus destroys our economy. These environmental leftists are trying to figure out, wow, how can we exploit this? How can we go from coronavirus police state lockdown into climate police state lockdown? Because society is being destroyed right now. This is what we really want. They're not worried about getting the economy open. They're worried about how they can advance their agenda.
Yeah, I've seen quite a few posts about look at how beautiful it is that nature is coming back, right? And nature's taking back. There'll be pictures of coyotes somewhere or a pond that looks clean, and I don't know the status of it before.
Scott.
Yeah, it's something I don't have a good grasp on. I don't know how much you know about this, but how free is the market in energy generally? Like, how much is the government involved in, or governments generally involved in regulating prices, setting prices, subsidies, all this stuff?
Of course, the government is involved in all parts of our economy. The good news about where we are in America is that there's just less of that. Yes, there are if you want to call them subsidies in the fossil fuel industry, we call them tax breaks. Okay. Okay. So there is some of that goes on. But you could take away all those subsidies, and I'm for doing that. I don't think anybody needs any subsidies. I think we should pay real prices for things. But you could take away all those subsidies, and we would still be with fossil fuels because solar and wind, number one, don't exist without fossil fuels and don't exist without subsidies at all. Fossil fuels would exist without subsidies.
Right. No, of that I'm sure. I mean, one of the things that comes to mind is I'm sure you know the history of corn subsidies and the development of corn syrup. And now I think we have corn and other crops being used for biofuel in a way that I'm not sure the free market would ever have produced biofuel.
No, it wouldn't. I mean, the reason we have biofuels is because Iowa is, a battleground state. I mean, that is the long and short of it. It's where the first primary is, and you have to go to Iowa and kowtow to the corn farmers. And as a result, we pollute our engines with ethanol. We make gasoline unnecessarily expensive. Ethanol does nothing for the environment. All it does is fatten the purses of Iowa farmers. I'd rather just give them the money and forget the ethanol.
Yep. How much of this is about actual worried about climate change or the human environment and pollution in the human environment? In other words, how much is connected to the quality of life of humans moving forward, and how much is connected to this vague idea that there could be warming?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's obviously a big question. I think that the environmental movement today is 99% politics. If environmentalists are really interested in, say, the plastic problem, you mentioned the kid lying on all the Coca-Cola bottles or plastic bottles, they really need to go to places like Africa and Asia where they really have a problem with solid waste disposal. If air pollution bothers you, well, then you need to go to India and China and work on that. Because in America, our environment is clean and safe. Our skies are blue. Is the air pristine? Well, it's as pristine as is going to get, considering we're an industrialized society of 330 million people. It's as clean as it needs to be. There's no one in this country that suffers from air quality, anything that's in the outdoor air, unless it comes from nature, like pollen. But nothing that comes out of a smokestack or a tailpipe is hurting anybody. And there are a lot of people that work on environmental issues. And of course, if you take a poll of the public, everyone's concerned. And while everyone's concerned about the environment, few people actually take the time to learn anything about it. And so as a consequence, there are a lot of people who feel the environment is an important issue, but they're being misled.
There also seems to be this calculus which ignores half of the equation, which is we're presented with this case of like, oh, here's the bad impact of our human activity on the environment, and let's just assume that it's all bad, as bad as they say. Here's this bad impact. What we need to do is stop the bad impact, but then they ignore the side of the equation, which is if we stop the bad impact, quote bad impact, it also stops cheap energy and has what negative consequences for people? There's not a lot of appreciation for the lives that are saved through cheap energy at all.
That's true. 40 years ago, Ronald Reagan introduced into the government the notion of cost-benefit analysis when doing environmental regulations. And it never really got implemented very well because EPA and bureaucrats figured out how to game the system. But there should be cost-benefit analysis done for environmental regulations, and you have to do the costs and benefits based on the best science and economics available. And one of the reasons I got into this is because when doing cost-benefit analysis, I discovered that the costs tend to be real, but the benefits tend to be imaginary. But they would pretend that the benefits were real. Like one of the Obama administration was great at this. They had the whole war on coal. It was premised on the notion that emissions from coal plant smokestacks were killing upwards of almost 600,000 people a year. Okay, and so when you value every life lost, every premature death at $10 million multiplied by 600,000 lives, well, there's no regulations that's not justified by that. But of course, nothing that comes out of a coal plant smokestack kills anybody. Doesn't cause a cough or wheeze, much less a death. So that whole part of the cost-benefit analysis was fake. But the real cost of shutting down coal plants, well, those costs were real. People lost jobs, and jobs where there's nothing else to do if they lose their job.
Yeah. You've got junkscience.com. You popularized the term junk science. One thing that I've seen in the last 20 years has been a shift from appreciation of science to worship of scientists. Can you draw the distinction between those two?
Yeah, that's a great point. I love that point. Science and scientists. Science is this terrific process developed through the Enlightenment to help us discover how the world works. And so, in my view, people who are scientists are people who do science. They are doing experiments, trying to figure out, classical liberals doing science, doing experiments. Those are scientists to me. In contrast to today, anybody who has a science degree considers themselves a scientist. Today's headlines, you read about how in the New York Times how President Trump is trying to muzzle his science advisors, but none of the people he's accused of trying to muzzle are really scientists. They're just public health bureaucrats. These people in the climate movement who consider themselves scientists. Well, the way science is done is you come up with a hypothesis, you collect data and test it, and you see whether your hypothesis was correct, and you go back to the drawing board, do it over and over again. With climate, it's completely different, and this has applications to this whole coronavirus crisis. Climate is all based on these models, which project that in 80 years, sea level rise is going to be 20 feet high, and the temperature is going to be 10 degrees Fahrenheit warmer. None of these models, like the coronavirus models, have ever been validated. All they are is essentially a hypothesis, and you'd have to run the experiment and collect the data at the end and see. But of course, we don't do that. We figure out, they figure out the model, they run the scare, and then they go with that and they call that science. And that's, of course, not science.
Yeah, and not only have they not been validated, I would say the credentials of the people that have been pushing these are in question, because every model they've pushed has been invalidated. They have been invalidated over time.
We're talking about climate coronavirus.
Yeah.
They're all the same. Well, it's true. None of them have been validated. None of the coronavirus models have been validated. Then we have this whole problem of, self-proclaimed scientists who go back in time and try to figure out what the temperature was 1,000 years ago. A famous example of that is the so-called hockey stick, which I call the hokey stick. It purports to represent temperature change over the past 1,000 years based on a handful of trees around the world. They looked at tree rings. It's completely invalid. There's no way to actually project global temperature. We have tens of thousands of temperature monitoring stations around the world today, and what the temperature is still in dispute. I don't know how you can say that 60 trees can tell you what the temperatures were for the last 1,000 years. It's totally nuts. Yet that hockey stick drove a lot of public policy during the 2000s.
Yeah, I mean, you reminded me of, there was that XKCD graphic where they tried to show, like, look how the temperature has changed, kind of stable, and then it hockey sticks at the end.
Right.
Yeah, but it turns out all of the data prior to the most recent data was smoothed over periods of a couple hundred years or something. So if it had been doing this, you wouldn't know. They smoothed it out, and then at the end they let it vary. And so of course it looks it's just so dishonest.
Yeah,
but it's presented as truth.
But when you have the bulk of the media out there saying presenting it as truth, it's difficult to argue with, right? Because you can't get any airtime.
Yeah. The other thing that strikes me about the science thing is science itself, just philosophically, science can't tell us what we should do. Science describes what happens in the world. It's like science is descriptive, not proscriptive. So you can't. Well, no matter what science says, it doesn't say anything about public policy, because public policy needs to account for praxeological, human action and motives and incentives and other factors. You can't just say the science says you got to pass this bill or have this policy. That's not how science works.
Right. And we hear this a lot from, say, Greta Thunberg. I call her Greta the climate puppet. She says we must listen to the science. Well, science doesn't really talk. And, with science, in the end, you get something like F equals MA. And there's a lot of things you can do with F equals MA, but it doesn't really lay out the public policy path.
Right. Not at all. And it's one piece of an equation. Science may very well. So just, society would have to struggle with a very real question. If all of science actually proved that, let's say your coal burning plant that you're talking about with Obama, let's say a certain number of people were dying from the coal emissions. Well, you would have to calculate what happens if we don't have the coal emissions. Will more people die? Will things be worse? It's still a cost-benefit equation, even if science is 100% demonstrating that there are real impacts that are bad.
Well, that's true. And this used to be politically correct to do. In the early days of cost-benefit analysis, you could do that sort of analysis. But you can't really do that anymore, because the notion of anybody dying is just too politically incorrect, and you just can't be associated with it. It's what's driving coronavirus hysteria today, right?
Right. Yeah, this idea that one death is enough to shut down life is inherently risky. We die from things. The idea that if really all we care about as a society is being safe, then we should just all be locked in padded rooms, and that should be the end of it. There's no freedom at all.
We just need a robust economy for society to thrive. This is just how it is, and we're finding out right now, without a thriving economy, what the costs are going to be. And these costs are going to go. We're going to see what they are next year and in the years to come. This is a horrible experiment we're doing.
I not to be a doomsdayer, but I really think this is depression. This is a depression that we're going into. What are your thoughts about the economic consequences of this moving forward?
Well, they're horrendous. I mean, we have 26 million people today who have filed unemployment claims. It's incredible that yet we're still an optimistic people because the market is still at 23,000, which is incredible. How could that ever happen? But yeah, I'm very worried about the economy. I understand what's going on and why President Trump is doing what he's doing. Unfortunately, this whole coronavirus thing has been awfully politicized because we have an election coming up. And, as expensive as it is to, these trillions of dollars that, Congress is just basically printing to support people in a shutdown economy, it's almost like a necessary evil because if in my view, if President Trump is defeated in the fall, oh my God, we're in deep trouble. So, I hate to see this. I hate to see the economy shut down. I hate to see, the government printing money, but I understand why it's being done.
It's frustrating too, though, because that the bailouts are. I think they roughly cost every American $10K, but the Americans are getting $1,200. A lot of that money is going to the means of production, right? It's going into capital goods, or at least supporting the higher orders of investment in the economy. So I think that might actually be one of the things propping the stock market up. I don't know what your thoughts are on that. It's kind of off topic for us today, but let's go.
No, we have an incredibly complex economy, and the notion that Congress can come up with a bill in a week to figure out how to distribute $2 trillion in aid is just ludicrous, right? You often hear the word sustainable or unsustainable with the environment. Well, that's unsustainable. This whole keeping the economy shut down is unsustainable, and
absolutely.
I'm surprised people haven't figured that out yet.
Yeah, and it's weird because I think you have to be in a pretty cozy, high standard of living position to not viscerally understand the emergency of not being able to go earn money and feed yourself. Like, that's an emergency.
You've got to be disconnected from reality. I'm fortunate. I work at home all the time, and I have for 20 years. So, but most people go out. And people work in restaurants and clubs and stores, and I can't imagine what those and they live paycheck to paycheck. I can't imagine what those people. How are they surviving? I can't go to the grocery store and buy toilet paper. Fortunately, I had gone to the big box store, and so I was fairly well stocked. But what is the average person doing? I can't imagine.
Yeah. Can we shift topics just for a moment? Because I know you have particular expertise with respect to the EPA, and I don't want to let that topic go without at least talking at a high level about it. You've got a book about fixing the EPA. I think people like me, I just have a general disdain for the EPA because all I remember is like reading about how they're trying to save some stupid frog while a farmer is trying to make a living or whatever. Can you talk about what's wrong with the EPA from a high level?
Well, what's wrong with the EPA is a long time in the making. The problem is that most of what EPA does is based on politics and not science. And let's concede that 50 years ago, our environment was not nearly as clean as it is today, and we have made a lot of progress. As our environment has gotten cleaner, EPA has grown and environmentalism has grown, and you think it would be the exact opposite. Today, most environmental protection is done in the states, by the states. There are a few interstate and maybe international issues where there's a use for EPA, but our EPA is way too big. It's at a point where not only do they make work based on fraudulent science. And they become a political weapon. President Trump, I was on the transition team for EPA, and we have all these plans. But the Trump administration is having a hard time reforming EPA because you have 13,000 recalcitrant employees, politicized employees that don't like President Trump, don't want to reform EPA. They like what they were doing. And, it's like any other bureaucracy. You create it and never wants to go out of business. It just wants to expand. So they keep making up problems to keep themselves in business. So, if we need an EPA, it's a much, much smaller one.
I mean, I think the way a lot of people think about the EPA, though, is like, well, if we didn't have the EPA, we wouldn't have clean water and air. They're preventing the nuclear power plant from moving in next door to you and dumping waste into your well water.
Yeah, no. We have all these laws in place. Okay, so it's not 1970 anymore. The rivers aren't on fire. The skies are a lot cleaner. There are no uncontrolled toxic waste sites. And while, and I think a lot of those laws need to be redone for the world we live in now. I mean, we are regulating the environment based on 1970s era laws. 50 years later, we need new laws. So all these laws are sunset and be redone. But it's not the EPA that, we have a lot of why our environment is so clean is because our culture has changed. Okay, businesses, there are obviously always bad actors, but generally speaking, businesses try to be as clean as possible. They just don't want the bad press, if nothing else, or the wrong kind of attention from the government or the media or the public. So, it's a different planet than it was in 1970, and we haven't recognized that yet.
I know we need to wrap up soon, so I want to get back to this documentary just for a moment. I do recommend people watch it. Obviously, there's a lot of interesting information in it. But the premise, as you pointed out at the beginning, the premise is still pretty much mankind is doomed. I think the documentary ends with this contextless footage of an orangutan suffering for a reason we don't know. And then there's a Rachel Carson quote. Rachel Carson was I guess famous environmentalist, scientist. And she says, humankind is challenged as it has never been challenged before to prove its maturity and its mastery, not of nature, but of itself. What is your message to people about the idea that humankind needs to rein in its devastation of the planet in general, that humankind needs to be careful because we're treading on thin ice and we're about to just go extinct. The Earth is going to purge itself of our vile existence.
Yeah, I don't have any apocalyptic visions of humanity. The only thing apocalyptic I can say is that if we allow environmentalists to take charge, a lot of people are going to die. You mentioned Rachel Carson. Rachel Carson, the environmentalists love her. She's a goddess because of Silent Spring. As far as I'm concerned, her misinformation has resulted in the deaths of tens of millions of Africans from malaria and others around the world. And that's what's in store for the rest of us if you let Greens be in charge. What we really need to do is we need to increase everybody's standard of living. We're projected to have 11 billion people on the planet by 2100. I mean, we're not going to live to see that. But for those people to thrive, they're all going to want to have food, transportation, place to live. And the only way that's going to happen is if they're wealthier, and wealthier people take better care of the planet. So I'm not apocalyptic at all. I mean, Paul Ehrlich, who wrote The Population Bomb in 1967, he said that the planet's carrying capacity was only at 2 billion people. We're at 7.6 billion right now. I'm going north, and we're doing great. People are living better lives than ever before. So I think there's no need to be apocalyptic. Overall, people will do the right thing. That is why there are 7.6 billion people now, because we have created an economy that allows for that many people to thrive, and we're going to have a lot more people in the future, and we've got to let the economy grow so that those people can thrive.
So I'm going to insert one other thing because this is interesting. Tell people about the DDT hoax, I'd like to call it, because you mentioned Rachel Carson's influence with respect to malaria in Africa, and I don't think people will know what you're talking about.
Sure. So Rachel Carson, she wrote her famous 1962 book, Silent Spring. which she accused DDT of killing birds and causing cancer in fish and just scaring the world about the application of chemicals. And the reality is much, and so this became attached to the bald eagle. The bald eagle kind of came to be a symbol of the evils of DDT. Supposedly DDT had driven the bald eagle to near extinction and was thinning eggshells and blah 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 blah. And leading up to 1972, when the EPA banned DDT's use in the United States, and then environmentalists basically exported that ban to the rest of the world, and as a result, DDT usage dropped in places like Africa and India, and tens of billions of people died over the years because they couldn't kill them. DDT was an incredible chemical, non-toxic to humans, but toxic to mosquitoes. And so the reality with DDT is that Rachel Carson was, of course, all wet. The bald eagle didn't disappear because of DDT. The bald eagle had disappeared 40 years before DDT was even invented, because it basically had been hunted to death. People, it was a predator. People would collect its eggs. People would collect its feathers. So the DDT was hunted to near extinction. There's news articles about this from the 1940s. DDT wasn't really invented on a large scale till World War II. And by the time DDT went into maximum use around the early 1960s, the bald eagle had already been on the rebound because hunting had basically been outlawed. There are no experiments that show that environmental levels of DDT thinned eggshells or that of any other great bird, peregrines, pelicans, what have you. There's just no evidence of that. DDT was not a threat to human health. When the concentration camp survivors were liberated in 1945, the first thing that happened to them is that they were doused in DDT. Why? Because it killed the bugs and was safe. And those are just facts. Do we need DDT today? Well, there are places where it could still be used. But the problem with the attack on DDT and the ensuing attack on all other pesticides is that we have not developed different and newer pesticides. So mosquitoes have developed resistance to DDT and other pesticides, and a lot of these vector-borne diseases are slowly coming back because using pesticides is politically incorrect.
Yeah, thank you for explaining that, because I remember as a kid growing up in the 70s I don't know if it was in school or on television, but I definitely remember commercials or propaganda, I guess, about the bald eagle and DDT and the thinning of the eggshells and so
it's very common propaganda, and it's all wrong.
Yeah.
I have a piece on junk science called 100 Things You Should Know About DDT, and it goes through all the DDT myths.
This is one of the things that's amazing about the DDT story to me is that it's something that a lot of us grew up with. We believe 100% it was scientific, and yet was completely false, and has never been retracted. Like no one really talks about. Oops, we killed a bunch of people in Africa.
So I mentioned that EPA banned DDT in 1972. What I didn't mention was that before EPA banned DDT, EPA held 9 months worth of hearings, collected 7,000 pages of testimony, or maybe it was 7 months of hearings and 9,000 pages of testimony. It doesn't really matter. Long hearings, huge amount of testimony, and in the end, EPA ruled that DDT didn't pose a threat to human health or the environment or wildlife. But the first EPA administrator, William Ruckelshaus, he banned DDT anyway because he was secretly part of the Environmental Defense Fund, which was the advocacy group lobbying to have DDT banned.
Even the EPA admitted it wasn't actually the threat that people were claiming, but they banned it anyway.
Threat, right?
Well, Steve, thank you very much for taking the time to join us today. I want to have you back and talk more extensively about climate change and some other issues in the future. But I think this was a good introduction to you, and for people who don't know junk science, I think this is good. And I hopefully people can watch this video and then check out your website. Just to be clear, you had nothing to do with the video. We're just critiquing it together. together here. Any final messages for our audience?
I just tell people to, God gave you a brain so you can think, and you don't just have to accept things at face value, which is how environmentalism works. People, they expect you to just believe it. And I never did. I always asked questions, and that's really the most important skill that you can have. Curiosity. It's a very important trait and skill.
Well put. Thanks for coming, Steve. Really appreciate it.
All right, Carter. Thank you very much.